In the early 2010s, my buddy Sean and I used to go camping in the Sierra Nevada. We'd usually pitch a tent somewhere near Mount Whitney or go hiking around Lake Tahoe, but we went all over the area. We were both native Californians, and our beloved mountain range was our absolute favorite place to spend time when we needed a break from the rat race. One time, we settled on a spot we'd never explored before. It was a fairly remote site off the beaten track, and we couldn't find any evidence that it had ever been camped at. Exactly the kind of spot that we liked. Sean basically spent most of our trips with a camera glued to his eye. Never, ever suggest to that man that he use a cell phone for photography. He'd been entering some online photo competitions, which is why he was so stoked when he found this pristine camping spot that none of the forums we'd frequented had ever mentioned. We set up our tent and spent the night beside a bunch of trees. We cooked up some burgers on our little stove, then settled in for the night. Everything passed without incident, and we awoke refreshed the next day, ready to explore the area. The spot where we camped was segmented by a small river. We followed the water upstream through the outcrops to the base of a small mountain. Sean paused to photograph what he insisted was a golden eagle flying overhead. A bit later, we spied a mountain lion prowling across some rocks, thankfully in the far distance on a different mountain. Eventually, we broke for lunch in the shade of a cliff face. I scrawled some notes in my journal while Sean snapped more pics. He disappeared behind some rocks, and then I heard him calling to me pretty excitedly. Sean had found a cave. Something about the gaping dark opening in the rock gave me the creeps, and I suggested that maybe we should move on. The area is home to black bears and various other things, and this easily could have been their lair. Sean said he wanted to get a few photographs of the cavern entrance. We were both armed and had bear spray, so it didn't seem too risky. We stepped into the opening, and almost immediately we were swallowed by darkness. Behind us, the sun beat down, but inside, the cave was pitch black. I snapped my flashlight on. The cavern seemed to descend deep into the rock. I stepped forward, curiosity getting the better of me, and something crunched under my foot. I looked down. It was some kind of bone. I felt Sean grab my arm. He whispered something and nudged my flashlight upward. There was movement deep in the cave, and I tensed, trying to decide if I should reach for my gun, when Sean spoke again. "It's a person," he said. A shadow darted across the beam of the flashlight. I called out, "Hello? Hello? Hello?" My voice echoed through the cave. Sean was whispering that we should hightail it out of there, and I knew he was right. But I was curious. "Don't be a moron," he said, as he began dragging me forcefully by the arm out of the hole in the rock. I called out, "Hello?" one more time, when a booming voice suddenly screamed, "Get out!" We ran out of the cave, tails between our legs, and decided that was enough exploration for one day. By the time we made it back to our tent, it was mid-afternoon, and I was looking forward to kicking back and getting some writing done. But we were met with a completely terrifying sight. Our tent was covered in blood. Up close, it was much clearer that someone had tossed a can of red paint all over the outside of the tent. Thankfully, we hadn't left anything important behind, but the tent itself was ruined. More paint had been splashed inside, soiling the sleeping bags too. It was a couple of hours' hike back to the car, and we had no shelter and nowhere to sleep. There was nothing to do but drive to the nearest town and get a motel for the night. We hung out in a bar just down the street from the motel and got talking to the bartender. We told him about our close encounter with that feral mountain man, and he just laughed. He seemed amused and surprised that we'd escaped intact. We decided not to go camping off the beaten path after that. I'm a former US Marshal, and I'm currently writing my autobiography. I'd like to share what might be the most memorable chapter of my career. You see, it all started late one Sunday evening back in October of 1986. I was sitting at home watching TV when the phone began to ring, and since no one called past 10 p.m., unless it was important, I slid over on the couch and picked it up. It was my supervisory deputy, and all he told me was, "Be at the federal courthouse, 8 a.m. sharp. You got a task force briefing." I'd been a deputy marshal coming up on 4 years by that point, long enough to know that when something big was brewing, that's exactly how it went down. No info on the target, no info on location, just a date and time for the briefing. After hearing him say task force, I had a reasonably good idea we'd be hunting a priority fugitive. But what I didn't know was that bringing him in would result in one of the strangest and most unsettling incidents of my entire career. The next morning, I drove over to the courthouse where I met my SD at the door. He directed me to a conference room on the second floor, and when I stepped inside, there was already half a dozen guys in there wearing a mix of suits, polos, and duty rigs. It was mostly my fellow marshals at first, but I also recognized an FBI special agent from the local field office. And then just before 8 a.m., the room filled up with half a dozen more marshals out of the Seattle office, a handful of state troopers, and a pair of detectives from the local PD. The room was buzzing with small talk and introductions as the caffeine started to kick in. But the chatter ceased immediately when the chief deputy marshal for the district walked in, flanked by an assistant U.S. attorney. He went to the speaker stand, set down his coffee, and got straight to business. "All right, listen up. We got a high-priority apprehension on our hands, and this could be a tough one. Fugitive's name is Raymond Ridgway, 42 years old, 6'2" with a lean build, red hair and brown eyes. Notable markings include burn scars to the palms of his hands and multiple tattoos. He's wanted on 4 counts of homicide, 2 in Idaho, 2 in Oregon, as well as 2 counts of murder of a federal officer. Ridgway will be armed and will have no qualms pulling the trigger on anyone wearing a badge. He's an animal, but he's as intelligent and cunning as he is unstable. And each of you would do very well to remember that when the time comes to bring him in." The marshals began swapping nervous looks as the chief paused again, and the assistant U.S. attorney stepped forward with a stack of folders, passing them out as the chief continued. Intel puts the target in the wilderness along the Canadian border. It's a needle in a haystack situation, but we've managed to narrow things a little. After instructing someone to dim the lights, the chief flicked a switch on an old overhead projector, and in an instant, the wall behind him lit up with a topographical map. "This is our target zone," the chief said, pointing towards a mountain peak which had been circled in red. "There's a shelf of even ground a few hundred meters from the summit. Easy access, and more than enough cover to keep him hidden. We think he's sheltering in the largest of 3 caves up there, probably alone. Elevation's around 8,500 feet. It's got steep approaches from all sides, and on top of all that, the snow has just started, meaning we've got a small window of opportunity before conditions lock us out altogether. We're going in with full tactical long guns and a chopper on standby. Our warrant states apprehend or neutralize, which means dead or alive. We can't risk using air transport, so after the drive out to the forest, it's a 10-mile hike to the base of the peak. At that point, you'll split into teams of 3. We move at first light. The next morning, we rolled out at dawn. A convoy of black SUVs and state trooper trucks cutting through the early morning haze. After an hour, our tires ground against loose rock as we turned off onto a gravel service road. The road narrowed fast, hemming us in with dense stands of pine and fir and mud sucking at the wheels as we climbed. Soon, the road ended at a dirt clearing with a rusty sign. We parked and stepped out into the half-frozen slush. We went over our plan one last time, then split. And that hike took hours. The trail started flat, but it soon pitched up. Sweat beaded around my temples despite the cold, and our breath puffed out as clouds as the trees thinned near the timberline, giving way to open slopes. The summit loomed closer, and by midday, we hit the base, our legs burning. A member of my team pointed towards a little white and brown bird lying dead on the ground. Then I saw another dead bird just a few yards away, and then another, and another, and another. There must have been 24 dead birds and squirrels lying at seemingly random spots on the forest floor. They didn't look half-eaten or decomposed. It was as if they'd only just dropped dead. I pulled the radio from my vest, hitting the transmit button as the wind began to pick up. I asked if either of the other teams saw anything weird or came across any dead birds, but they said no, negative. I looked back at my team and clipped the radio back onto my vest. We started climbing again and eventually crested the final rise where the wind eased, blocked by a low ridge of rock. Ahead of us was the opening to a cave, a jagged gash in the rock about 10 feet wide and half hidden by a slab of granite. It had to be the only real shelter up here, and was the obvious spot for Ridgway to be holed up. We spread out, rifles raised, moving low and quiet towards the cave's entrance. I signaled to hold positions as I confirmed the other team's arrival. We advanced together, this tight semicircle closing in. At the entrance, I flicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark as we stepped inside. The cave wasn't deep, maybe 30 feet at most, but it narrowed fast. Inside, the air was damp and sour. We advanced carefully, scanning every nook with our flashlights, and then, about 10 paces in, We saw him, Ridgway, sitting with his back to us in the cave's deepest point. We called for him to surrender, to lay down with his hands on the ground. But he didn't turn. He didn't even flinch. He started rocking back and forth, slow and rhythmic, with his head bowed. We yelled again, but there was still no reaction from the guy. He just kept rocking back and forth like he couldn't hear us over the noises in his own head. The deputy to my left, a guy named Torres, moved forward, allowing his rifle to hang from its sling as he reached for Ridgway's shoulder. But the moment his hand made contact with the man, his body locked up like he'd been hit with a live wire. He gasped, eyes wide, and then collapsed to the hard ground. His arms jerked in spasms, his boots scraping the dirt as spit foamed from the corners of his mouth. Ridgway jolted awake and whipped around. His eyes were wild with confusion as they darted between us. We demanded he surrender, and he just smiled, then slowly flattened himself against the cave floor. We zip-tied him fast, dragging him up as medics rushed over to Torres. The chopper was inbound within 20 minutes. Torres was strapped to a stretcher and lifted out with the medic, and Ridgway went next. He just sat there cuffed and staring blankly as we loaded him up. We cleared the cave, and the job was done. We were told the medics had to put Torres in a coma to stop the seizures, and he didn't wake up for a week. But when he did, he remembered nothing. The medical report called it a sudden neurological event, either an epileptic fit or a stress-induced collapse. Doctors chalked it up to a 1 in a million fluke that just so happened to hit when he touched Ridgway. No link to the cave, the birds, or anything else up there. Torres was assigned to desk duty for a while, and then he transferred out. We never heard from him again. Ridgway was in custody, locked up and pending trial, but he refused to talk. He just sat there in his cell, rocking back and forth, just like he'd done up in that cave. The report barely mentioned all of the animal corpses, relegating them to a single line buried in the details. Investigators shrugged it off. They said Ridgway must have been hunting them, so there were no tests or samples taken. I've had a long time to process what happened, almost 40 years in fact, but still, it gnaws at me. I know I should just let it go, but leaving it all unexplained feels like leaving a loaded gun on the table. Nothing about that day adds up, and worst of all, no one else ever seemed interested in finding out why.